Hi, everyone. Welcome to everyone that's funneling in. We just want to welcome everyone to today's event with Pat McCabe and Dr. Carolyn Finney as they discuss the intimacy of right relations. Thank you all for being here. My name is Divya. I'm a senior here at Middlebury, joint majoring in environmental studies and chemistry.
And hi, I'm Gabe Desmond, and I'm in my final semester here at Middlebury, majoring in environmental studies, but with a focus in religion and philosophy. And Divya and I are going to be moderating tonight's event. So to start off, we just want to thank the Franklin Environmental Center and all of our other co-sponsors you can see on the screen for helping make tonight's event happen. And throughout the night, we encourage you to submit any questions you have into the Q&A box, and at the end of the night, we'll be opening up for Q&A over the last half hour or so.
Wonderful. Before we introduce our conversationalists, we would like to pause to acknowledge that Middlebury College sits on land which has served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous peoples since time immemorial. The Western Abenaki are the traditional caretakers of these Vermont land and waters, which they call Ndakina, or homeland. We remember their connection to this region and the hardships they continue to endure. Let us take a moment of silence to pay respect to the Abenaki elders and to the Indigenous inhabitants of Turtle Island, past and present. Thank you. We give thanks for the opportunity to share in the bounty of this place and to protect it. We are all one in the sacred web of life that connects people, animals, plants, air, water, and earth. I'd now like to introduce one of our speakers, Woman Stands Shining, Pat McCabe. Pat is a Dene mother, grandmother, activist, artist, writer, ceremonial leader, and international speaker. She draws upon the Indigenous sciences of thriving life to reframe questions about sustainability and balance, and she's devoted to supporting the next generations, Women's Nation and Men's Nation, in being functional members of the hoop of life and upholding the honor of being human. She's a voice for global peace, and at the center of her work is individual, earth, and global healing.
And tonight in conversation with Women Stand Shining is going to be Dr. Carolyn Finney, who is a storyteller, cultural geographer, and author. In the past, she's been a Fulbright scholar and is regularly featured in media outlets, including Outside Magazine and Newsweek, for her work on race, privilege, and the environment. Her first book, Black Faces, White Spaces, encouraged readers to reevaluate how they perceive the relationship between African Americans and the great outdoors. She is currently a scholar in residence at Middlebury's Franklin Environmental Center, and both Divya and I are lucky enough to be in the class teaching right now this fall on environmental icons. So before we hand it over to them for the night, I'm just going to give you a brief rundown. So we'll the two of them will be in conversation for up until right around 8. And after that, we'll open it up for Q&A before some closing statements. So without further ado, please all welcome Carolyn and Pat.
So I want to say greetings to each and every one this evening. Thank you for that beautiful acknowledgement of the Abenaki peoples. And in addition to that, I asked if I couldn't say some opening words as a dedication for our gathering, where 2 or more are gathered this evening, and serve the change that we are.
So now it's us, right? It's
No,
us.
it's us.
It's a woman stands shining, Pat McCabe. It's us. Okay, so, well, so the audience knows. So Pat and I, met a couple of times over the last few weeks to think about what's the container we want to create for ourselves. We had to give ourselves a place to start without rehearsing it. But as we're sort of building our relationship, or at least this is how I saw it, right, Pat? How are we kind of getting to know each other? What's the space? How do we show up authentically and with transparency? And to really honor the prayer that Women Stand Shiny just shared with us. So the first question we sort of asked of ourselves, what interests us in showing up to a conversation like this? What interests us in showing up to a conversation like this? I can start because we know the green tea caffeine that I drank earlier really took me there. I'm really on a roll, right? So, okay.
Yes, Carolyn, go for it.
Well, actually, thank you. Actually, I was always really a little intimidated by a conversation like this. So if I'm really honest, right, as somebody who, I call myself African-American, Black, I was raised by Black parents, I was also adopted. And so even my African-American parents have a real clear sense. They have some Cherokee blood, they have some European blood, they can trace it, they know where it is in their family. What they claim is Blackness, as we talk about it here in the United States, but they can point to the genealogy. As someone who's adopted, I can't point to any genealogy. So there's a way within which coming into this conversation about land and place and belonging and the environment as a Black person who can claim so little of that, I am aware of, like, there was an Indigenous presence here long before, if we're thinking about it purely in limited terms, what it means to be Indigenous, right? They were here long before. And I realized I don't know half the time how to honor that. I spend a lot of time wanting to heal, think about, challenge, uplift Black stories, because I feel like Black stories in this country, as well as others, but Black stories have been erased. Black experience gets erased. We use words like marginalized and left out, and as though we don't already have something. We're not fully embodied, realized people on the land, and we help to shape the land in a very particular way. But it's complicated because actually we weren't here first either, right? And so what does that mean? And just the whole idea how I've been taught that humans and nature are separate, I know is not correct. I know it's not correct, but how do I unlearn that? And even as a Black person, yeah, I can claim certain things around my Blackness, but I can only go so far because we weren't first here either. So I've been wanting to have this conversation with someone for my own learning, as well as my own sharing, because I'm also about boundary crossing, bridge crossing. We are more than what we seem. How do I do the thing that I ask everybody else, which is, how do we talk across difference? How do we stand in the tension of that difference? And it's not about agreeing, but what does that look like? That's the short answer. Pat McCabe, shining.
Yeah, no, it's a long story. It's a long story. I just really want to say that I am, I'm kind of quivering at the beginning of such a conversation. This is tender. This is tender territory. I think it's been presented to me as though there were two separate stories running in terms of this very recent overlay of something that we call the United States onto this part of the Mother Earth. So first, I want to just get it out there that, there were millions of people here for millennia. I mean, we're finding human presence here going back even 130,000 years. Okay, so there was human presence here for a long time. There were thousands of civilizations on this continent. So I think for me, it's important to say that this whole continent was not a blank page waiting for someone else to come and make a mark on it. I want to say also that, when finally, the part of the story that really engages the quote unquote American imagination of the folks coming over from Europe, what they found here was this an unbelievably lush land. And so the other part of that story that has been portrayed in our history books and such is that, this was just like feral, wild flora and fauna here that these explorers stumbled upon. And so what I want to say is that actually the reason there was this unbelievable flora and fauna bounty here was because of the way the existing civilizations that were all over this continent had been tending to land and their relationship with land and their understanding with land. So this is sort of going way back for a backdrop for this conversation. And so there's that story of when that part of this continent's life changed with two very different paradigms of understanding how to be human collided here. And so then we have the introduction also of peoples, the stolen people from stolen lands, also being brought into this strange equation, this strange fruit, if you will, that was being created here. And so for me, it has always been presented to me, I think, even as I considered, how US history was being misrepresented. I understood that from indigenous perspective, but I've sort of bought into this story that, then there was this African presence that was introduced, and they had their own separate story from our story. Well, the more that I've gotten into these conversations, the more I realize, no, our stories are very, very intertwined, and even blood-wise, hugely intertwined. And so, it has always seemed to me, in a very quite off the earth, sort of pie in the sky way, that, man, we should be natural allies.
Yeah.
Given our placement within this story of the development of this civilization upon this part of the earth that was overlaid over millennia of another kind of civilization. And I was just thinking, but we're not. We have not been allies.
Yeah.
We have been systematically pitted against each other. And yet we carry so much, some very similar wounds. So, for me, if I can be a part of opening that conversation, and what I say is, I'm not so versed in the acronyms and the terminologies that I hear a lot of young people using around, quote, BIPOC. I mean, even that term, which we'll get to later, by the way, I got some beef with that.
Yes.
But I say, at least if I'm willing to step forward and just do it all wrong, then maybe everybody who comes after me will feel really comfortable stepping into this place, because this is a part of realigning what is existing here now in this nation to a possibility of having thriving life. So that's what's drawing me here.
Yeah, and I want you really made me think of a few things. Actually, I was thinking about how, for me, what I heard was, how risky this. I mean, I feel like it's a risky conversation. You've got two groups of people. We as Pat and I were talking earlier, we're saying red nation, black nation, that are incredibly diverse in and of themselves, right? That's broad brushstroke even for me to say red and black as though there isn't diversity within there, who have had, in some ways, from the majority culture, our stories told in a way that actually doesn't necessarily serve who we are and who we can be, right? And denies our capacity to tell that story ourselves, because we tell it anyway, but really, it has denied our capacity. I was thinking about today how I'm giving up some of the goods now, but I was born in 1959 and my birth certificate says Negro on it, right? I was thinking about that, like as an artifact of claiming and naming myself and my place here. That's how it starts. And I know that neither my biological parents or my adoptive parents made that choice, right? That was the state made that choice in a very particular way. And so there's something also for me, what happens, can we align across this, this common ground, very broadly common about having, that we already have our stories and how we show up here with our stories, even when they conflict. Because, you know, I was talking earlier to some folks about renaming the John Muir Institute, a building out in California, Northern California. And there was something about, you know, there's a lot of problems for me with John Muir, right? But John Muir is a person. John Muir was this full, complex individual. For me, John Muir wasn't evil. John Muir was white. And I say that, you know, with a smile on my face going, you know, because whiteness for me, it's about power. It's not about good or evil, you know, and it actually denies the human responsibility in making some of the choices one can make at a time, right? I'm not saying there's not things about him problematic, there are. So I don't know. I've been thinking about how do we tell those stories knowing we don't agree on everything? You know, the word reparations for me is really fraught. Because if I'm just talking to Black people, knowing that we're diverse, you know, reparations, if I know all of you better out there, I just wrote a skit about it that I'd love Dave Chappelle to do as a joke about, I know I've already told Pat about it, but I don't know if I feel comfortable sharing it here, my little skit about reparations as a joke, not to make light of it, but actually to sort of ground it. There's something about, you know, as a Black person, is it that I want to name and claim a place for my own? Is there something my ancestors are owed, even if I don't know who they are? Is there something they're owed? Is there something my parents are owed? And I kind of think there is, but, you know, but what is our right? Like, what can I do differently? Because actually, it's not mine. It was never mine. You know, it was never mine. The land was never mine. The trees were never mine. The ocean were never mine. The air was never mine. You know, my sovereignty shouldn't depend on what I own. So, yeah. So I don't even know how to hold that. I'm always feeling stressed about it, like how to be in conversation about it. Ooh.
Yeah, and so I think another thing that draws me to this conversation was a very risky conversation, but it wasn't public. You know, this evening looks like we have 124 of us gathered for this. This was a conversation between 3 of us, and it felt very risky that night. And there was this whole other group around us. We were like in a break time before we were all going to be at dinner. And so the 3 of us somehow got on this, were willing to strike up this conversation, and the whole room was like listening, but they were pretending like they weren't really listening because nobody was sure where it was going to go, and it could be very, you know, volatile and etc. But, you know, in that conversation, I really, and in some other ones that I've been a part of on a much smaller scale, you know, I just really felt the hurt, just the hurt of my Black identifying relatives. And so there's a big part of me that wants to say, first of all, you know, and so again, I want to notice that when we say Black, we're not only talking about people coming from Africa, we're talking about other people coming from other places, or maybe they came from Africa originally, but they came to the United States via other places. There were big routes that people found themselves here. But in any case, I want to acknowledge that I'm only just now recognizing how painful that is to be displaced. I mean, not displaced, stolen. I mean, it's been hard enough on this continent for Indigenous people to be displaced, to be removed from place. Now, this is something that maybe not everybody can know who is from modern world paradigm. And that is that indigenous, that word indigenous, if we think about it, it means of place. And so what I say is culture is not a human construct. Culture is the Mother Earth expressing herself as human being in any given place. So if I'm from the desert, you know, my people are really big on turquoise because that's what we find here. So we have a particular relationship with that, and it gives us health. It gives us inspiration. It connects us in ways to the land. And so, you know, we over long periods of time, millennia, which is something that's hard for modern world paradigm to grok because people are moving every 2 and 3 years in modern world paradigm. So imagine living someplace for having a lineage someplace for 2,000 years. Like, you not only know weather patterns and constellation patterns and water patterns, and I mean, it's a deep relationship. And so really it becomes very symbiotic, a human being to a place. And so that human being can be a part of causing that particular place to thrive. And that place thriving causes the human beings to thrive. So it's this back and forth. And not only between Earth and human being, but between all the rest of the life that is around. And so, you know, it's a big deal to displace an indigenous person from that relationship because it's not real estate and it's not resource. It's a symbiotic way of life of thriving. And so, you know, we know that pain here in the United States. Some of the indigenous peoples who were removed from their original territories, as Dene people, we still actually have a lot of our, or at least some of the, well, we have quite a bit of our original territory, let's just say. But so for me to acknowledge like what that was like for the indigenous peoples of Africa to be just uprooted and brought here. So they're not modern world paradigm people. They're not part of colonization people. They're not, you know, and what is that like to just be on a whole nother continent, you know? So just really being able to acknowledge the stress and pain of that is really important to me because I'm just kind of, I'm sorry to say I'm late in the game, but I'm realizing, wow, what could that be like? And also to, and that helps me to understand some of the angst about my very presence. Because while we're in the same situation, I was about to say the same boat, but we're not. While we're in the same situation of it relative to the colonization of this land, we're in really different places in many ways. So, you know, even as many indigenous people are saying, you know, well, why don't those people just go back home? Well, you can't say that to a Black person because they're like, well, one, it's, I don't know, I think that's not really where my mindset is at in general. But you know, but I've talked to Black people and they're like, you know, I can't say even what part of Africa I might have come from. It was that obliterated. And so here are these people who are stranded. And for me, that's a huge piece of brings up a huge piece of compassion.
And not only feeling stranded, but the reality is, I believe, is that, I'm sorry, I can look at me and my skin in the mirror and I know I don't have to get the DNA testing to know that, you know, I'm not a purebred African of African descent, right? I know that mixed up with that, you know, being stolen, separated from, you know, perhaps our original homeland where perhaps we were thriving as well, right? And much the way, you know, Pat, that you're saying, right, that we got embroiled in this, you know, we were used, abused, taken advantage of, raped. I mean, let's just call it all out. And to add insult to injury, I mean, and I'm just going to say it, for many of us, this capitalist, this overlay of capitalism, consumerism in a very particular way, justifying, among many things, having Black people work the land for free to build the backbone of the economy. But actually, when we were given our freedom, I'm just saying it like that on purpose, many of us chose to strive for the same thing. That what we're going to do now is make the money, buy the land, do the thing to get ahead, moving on up. I mean, I'm just going to say it, right? So some of us are caught, a lot of us are caught in that as well. And it's hard to, on one hand, we should be able to choose whatever it is we want to do for ourselves or family, really, isn't that what freedom is? Or is it? Like, so what does it mean to be free from a people who had to fight for it every single minute they were on this damn continent, had to fight for freedom every single minute. And I would argue are still fighting for it. And even when we have agency to make a different set of choices than somebody who looks like me might have been able to do 400 years ago, I often say to people that I love science fiction. I love the idea of time travel, but if I got to look like me, I ain't traveling back 300 and 400 years. I don't know about the rest of you. Like, if I have to look like me and do it, that scares me to death, because I already have some sense of what was going down at that time. And I certainly don't want to look like me in doing it. So what does that mean? What does even the aspiration look like? What does the aspiration for a Black or brown person on this continent look like right now to be in right relation, right? And I just want to own that it was Women Stand Shining who brought that phrase in, not me. What does it mean to be in right relation? Because that assumes for me that I've got to be in right relation with myself, but I don't really know everything about myself, not because I haven't tried to figure it out, but because of everything you just said, right? The idea that, stolen people on stolen land, mixed heritage, infused, blood from who knows where and when, oftentimes not out of choice, showing up here. And as I said to someone, a white friend of mine not long ago, because she wanted to know, how I see myself. And she was like, you're mixed. I was like, no matter how you want to claim it and name it on a piece of paper, I've been treated Black my whole life. That's just the truth. And that actually means something here. So I don't know. I guess one of the things I'm trying to work out is, again, like you're saying, the hurt, the loss, the anger, because the anger is real. And I can only speak for me, right? I'm not speaking for any other Black person. But if I get below my hurt and my anger is my own deep capacity for love, and that we deserve to be loved, and that we have had to fight for 400 years and we're still asking the same thing, not begging for it because we don't need to beg, we're willing to die for it, but that we are still having this conversation. And I still get upset. I was like, we are still having this conversation. We are still having this conversation. I don't care how we intellectualize it, but we are still having this conversation about our basic humanity, and that any human being from any walk of life should have to have this conversation, for me, is highly problematic. Oh, sorry that I went there already, but yes.
Wow. So as I listen to you, that question, what is there even to aspire to? Like, what is correct, right relations with self, with dignity, with the honor of being human being, with creator, if that's how you like, what is right aspirations in that situation? I'm just, boy, that just really hits me. Because I can see, as I look across the fence, or what I think I see is, you can't go along with the party line of this nation's aspirations, And I certainly know that as an Indigenous person. It's like, like literally over my dead body, right? Because if I go that route, I complete the genocide. I am a survivor of attempted genocide. And if I go that route of assimilation, which there was, not everybody knows the extent to which this newly forming nation, I mean, this nation is just a punk, man. It's not even 300 years old yet. It's a punky upstart still, compared to pretty much everything else on the planet, it seems like. It's a weird situation here. And so, what I have to say is, man, this upstart went to great lengths with my people. I mean, they aligned with church. I mean, church and state came together big time for us, and they created these residential schools, and they made it law that any little Native kid running around that anybody saw had the legal right to go and grab them and bring them to one of these schools. So that why? I mean, they stated what the purpose of these schools were, so that they would have the opportunity to instill in our children a repulsion so great for our own culture that we would never even want to go back. That was the game. I mean, after I don't know, and somewhere in there they switched from wanting to just kill us all. 9 out of 10 Indigenous inhabitants of this continent were exterminated. That's a very polite term. They were exterminated. And so with the remaining peoples, so these are all these civilizations that knew how to make this place thrive, they got wiped out. And the remaining ones, and this is something that my daughter brings up in her work, Lila June Johnston, some of you may know. She says, so really the peoples that we encounter and that we know of, even historically, as there's many speeches that we see from some of the great spiritual leaders as this country was being formed. They are traumatized versions of what lived here. And they're still pretty freaking amazing, but they were traumatized versions of the peoples that were here. So imagine the untraumatized versions of this, and the spiritual knowledge and the right relation science that we had. To have nations here with unintelligible languages living side by side for hundreds of years. Doesn't mean there wasn't ever conflict, or there wasn't ever wars, or there weren't ever mistakes. But overall, whatever kinds of conflicts and wars we were having, we were not wiping out the place. We were still able to create thriving life on this whole continent. And as I keep saying that word, whole continent, not just this country, because I want to impress upon us this idea that this whole continent was a single living organism. You got to remember, this was beyond nation state mentality. The whole continent was a thriving single organism. Okay, so I'm kind of off on a tangent there, but so this is this is what was trying to be rubbed out. And so as a person, as an Indigenous person of a lineage from here, so deep, that goes back so far, it's like, it's imperative to me to not complete the genocide. I had a deep, tender conversation with my youngest son. And I was, because he was asking about a really tough time in our family's relationship. It was when his father and I split up, and it wasn't real graceful, let's just say. And he finally was ready to talk about it. And I told him, I said, you deserved better, you deserve someone who could model something better for you. But what I want to tell you about it, and it's not an excuse, but it's a reality and it's present, is our family has a lot of trauma. My grandparents were sent to a Dutch Christian Reformed residential missionary boarding school. And then my parents were, that's where they met. And so even though I wasn't sent to that school, all that trauma from that experience traveled down the line to me. And I have it in me. I said, so you might have noticed, son, that for as long since you were born, I have been in therapy, I have been in groups, I have been doing everything I can possibly think of to manage that trauma. Because if I can't manage that trauma, that's the other way that I can complete the genocide, is if I implode in hatred, if I implode in self-destructiveness or destructive of everything around me, then I also feel like I complete the genocide. So I'm walking this tightrope about that aspect of being here in this nation. And so, when you say, where do you draw your inspiration from? Well, and your aspiration. And so for me, I still have places to go here that speak of another way of being human that I can still draw aspiration and inspiration from. And so it really strikes me when you present it the way you did about like, and where do I as Black nation get this inspiration and aspiration, because it cannot come from this land.
And oh my God, so Women Stand Shining, Pat McCabe, I just like to say the whole thing, that when you were talking about, when I just heard you say that, the way that you have your culture and your language and everything wiped out, you're being sent to school, and the risk of, perpetuating that genocide. And I was thinking about Black people in this country. And I think for us, one of the ways that showed up differently, at least in my head, is that it wasn't so much we were sent off to boarding schools and told we can't have that language, though, we can talk about, ebonics and all the ways within which, we kind of, in our diverse ways, show up in our lives. But we were basically told by all we had to do as individuals, it was insidious, is look in the mirror and hate yourself. And here's all the ways we're going to teach you to do it. We're going to start from the beginning in terms of everything from how you wear your hair, the color of your skin, the size of your lips, the way your body looks, the way you talk, where you live, who you know. We are going to everything about you, what we call you. We are going to remind you. And then what we're going to do, at one point, we're going to stop because, it's civil rights and everything. So we're going to stop doing that. And we're not going to say it out loud anymore. But we're going to remind you that assimilation is the key. We are the Borg, for those of you who watch Star Trek. We're going to remind you. And that if you want to succeed, you're going to have to do it like this, which is still a denial of yourself, although we're leaving it up to you to make the choice. So it's nothing like committing genocide to yourself, because here's the thing. You want to be promoted? Here's what you have to do. You want that job? You better change that name. Here's what you have to do. If you want to be here, here's what you have to do. And then we will provide you with the proper affirmation. And we want to know why we're not looking in the mirror and don't feel like we're entirely crazy, that we're not entirely crazy. So, I often think, when I go in front of particularly predominantly white audiences, one of the reasons I started with my own story is not because I particularly like to talk about myself, but because for every Black person I know, it always starts with ourselves. We are not simply an idea. We're not simply a thought that we have, and we're not simply something else that someone else tells us. We have to bring ourselves wholly in the room, because if we're waiting for anybody else to do it, we may be waiting forever. The Black poet Nikki Finney, not long ago in her new book, talked about that. Like, we are responsible for our memories and our stories, the artifacts of our existence. And not that we haven't done that in many ways, even though we often get denied in terms of the value of our stories. We get appropriated, we get transacted, we get extracted all the time. And I know what I'm admitting. These aren't the only things that happen, but I'm feeling really, I'm feeling all the love. That's why I'm here. But man, I got to say all this other stuff on top of it, because like you, if I can say this, Pat, there's the trauma, the pain, the insecurity that I never know at what second, or many of us never know at what second we will be denied, or we're going to have to duck and weave our way to the top. And the idea that we even think that there's a top is like, how have we been tricked into this? Like, what happened? We are so vibrant on our own in relation with everybody else and everything else. why do we think we got to give it up?
So when you said assimilation is the key, or could be the key, or is presented as the key, let's just say it that way, I'm going to say, and even that's a trick. because a brown person can assimilate as much as possible, and it's still not a key to the whole shebang, right? No. And so I wanted to say, you know, I'm looking at, you know, our little plan that is sort of like blown to bits. It's fine because we're going there. But you know, what I wanted to talk about a little bit was so this makes, so everything we've said hopefully now can make this next statement a little bit more clear and relevant. And that is to say, so if we were to quote undo racism, can we see that it is also undoing an entire paradigm? So this is, to me, a clear way of talking about the intersectionality between race, between environmentalism, between economic disparity, et cetera. So economics. And so if we were to just focus on the racism and undo it, we're still working on how in the world can we do that? And there's so much amazing work being done. But it's speaking to this entire paradigm, the paradigm that came here and did not recognize that there was a science going on here higher than any science that they had ever conceived of. That was not possible in their mindset. And yet today, 200 and some odd years later, 251 years later, I guess it is, we are grasping for what they found when they arrived. How do we get there, we say? How do we make this place thrive again? We're killing it, we're killing it, we're killing it. How in the world do we make this place thrive again? Well, I'm sorry, I got to point it out. It's like, well, that's what you ran into when you first got here. Dang it, you know. And so this is so really for me, it's all about paradigm. It's about looking at this whole structure of paradigm. And one of my main things is to say, you know, paradigm is a choice. This is how it's been presented to me spiritually. And I hope that this conversation, so I want to notice that this conversation, you know, as I was approaching it, I was like, so one, I want to have this conversation and learn from Carolyn. And she's already expanded so much for me in this short time we've been together just tonight. And at the same time, we are also trying to address a very likely non-Indigenous, non-Black audience. So we're educating at the same time as we're learning from each other. So hopefully this is also some really clear evidence about why there are spaces needed that are for people of color, because we need to discover a lot here. And when we have to do dual duty of this and educate about, do you guys realize what US history actually is? And this is the impact of it. So I just want to point that out. But
and can I just add something there about that too? Because I want to really, you know, and I think this, you know, and Women's Science Strategy said this earlier, that it's so important, right? You know, the role of everybody who's in this, you know, we're the two main people, but everybody who's come to this moment here. And for me, it is, and I think I said it earlier, but maybe I only said it in my head, that, you know, to have a conversation between someone who's Indigenous and Black, for me, where whiteness isn't centered, but it's in the room, because that's also part of the reality. But it's not an opportunity that I get very often, but everybody should be in the room. That's the thing for me. It's like, for me, I don't want to have a secret conversation with an Indigenous person. I mean, we may have and build our own relationships, and then there may be a private thing in there. But in terms of my larger intention, which is in line with a lot of what I heard Pat say early on when she started, like what I want, what I aspire to, this idea of right relation for me, if I think about other human beings, standing in the tension of the difference, how do I recognize someone's total humanity while also honoring their difference? And what I maybe can learn from that and grow from that without having to relinquish anything of who I am that doesn't serve the larger, whatever that is. You can fill in the blanks, right? And I'm still trying to figure out what that is. So there's also something about, I hope that everyone in the room hears that, and that knowing that you're listening actually serves me in a very particular way, because it's causing me, I have to really work at something in a way. I'm not saying it ain't easy to do, but that's, for me, it's work. So I have to work at it. I have to try to do my best to be clear and articulate what I mean. I'm going to be honest. And also there's an element of trust. I mean, I don't know how you're feeling with this. I've just been like, oh my God, I'm already starting to go, oh, I said that thing earlier. I don't even know who's listening. What does that mean? Did I just go, like it's this kind of, I'm ducking and weaving in my own head. I just want to, feel that, no, I just, let me say the thing, and want people to know that it's because I believe in our collective fullest possibility, and I don't know what that is. But I cannot pretend that it's pretty where we are right now, because I don't think it is, which doesn't mean that we don't have the capacity for something else.
So I guess I'll say that it serves me also to have everybody in the room. I mean, I don't know who you all are. I don't get to see you all. All right, just so you know, I only get to see Carolyn basically at this moment. So I don't know who else here, but I suspect that we've got, a lot of folks in the room. I think it serves everybody to be in this room. Yeah. Certainly if you're from this nation. But I'm also going to say that I really crave, it's not so much that I want it to be secret, but there is another dynamic. If we could also have some conversations with Black Nation and Red Nation only in the room, let's just say. And so I also wanted to bring this up, this little piece right here. I don't know how well we can see it, but it's the medicine wheel, huh? And it's not, my light is so harsh right here. Sorry, it's just nighttime over here. But you can't quite make out what's going on the bottom, but you can definitely see what's going on the top, right? So this is a representation of many things. It's a representation of seasons. It's a representation of unending cycles. But it's also a representation of all the colors of man, so to speak. Black, red, yellow, white. That's what's going on the bottom. It all looks kind of white in my camera, but there's actually yellow in there too. So black, red, yellow, white. And so for me, spiritually, I'm thinking about this very neat symbol that talks about so much of life. The mechanics of it, the quantum physics of it, the feeling of it. And so I just keep having to ask, what there's something very specific about Black and red being next to each other for me. There's something that we're holding here together. And so this is on this continent, but it's also throughout this construct of our lives. And so this is part of what's really driving me forward also, is like, there is a potential here that if we could understand what this is speaking to, like, it's been so disrupted that it's hard to really, at least I'm trying to remember, what is this dynamic about? There is a potential here of, if something could come together again, that this whole wheel would be intact and therefore could fulfill everything that is possible for it to fulfill. And so I'm really trying to think, and that's a big part of what makes me want to be in this conversation, is what does Black Nation hold for humanity, I'm asking? And what does Red Nation hold for humanity? And for that matter, white and yellow as well. And, that's supposed to encompass everybody. And so I'm thinking about that. and I'll just say that, you know, the one other piece that we were wanting to touch on a little bit was, you know, so that term BIPOC, let's just maybe and
Just
talking a little bit about that, right?
yes.
So Black, Indigenous, people of color. And, you know, I had another conversation with somebody a couple of weeks ago, and that was the first thing that we were noticing is like, first of all, we're like immediately separating, there's Black people and then there's Indigenous people. So right away, we're creating this setup of saying Black people aren't Indigenous, for one thing.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that's problematic right away for us, for those of us who are trying to have consciousness around this potentiality and et cetera. Like right away, we're setting it up in a funky way, in my view. And so I'm thinking, you know, I have to dig a little deeper. And so just overall, especially for our young viewers, because this is as I'm getting old enough to where I'm you know, I'm having to look and talk about you young people and all your lingo and your especially your acronyms, right? And so I just really hope that part of what this conversation can serve is that, you know, this is not concept. We throw a lot of concepts around, and then we even reduce those concepts down to acronyms. And so I really just want us to notice all, and we're just barely scratching the surface here, all the emotion, all the grief, all the complexity, all, and even, you know, Carolyn's story, my Indigenous person's story versus my great-grandparents' Indigenous person's story, or versus another tribe's, or versus a family that who had never had any family member go to residential boarding school. So I just really ask us to keep noticing, you know, and that's why we named this what we did. Who's got skin in the game? Man, there is skin in the game going on here. And so I'll ask us to have a little pause in throwing around these terms and concepts here.
And we have 1 minute left before we open it up to, and I don't know that.
I think we have three.
Oh, we got three. Oh, hello. You know, yes to all of that, because one of my brothers, my youngest brother, texted me the other day because he was in conversation with his daughter who's young and recently married, and both African American. He's African American, and he said, "Do you know what the term BIPOC means?" He sent me a text, and I went, "Oh, you know, Black, Indigenous, people of color." And he said, we were having this discussion, like, why are people using it? It sounds like people are just trying to be extra politically correct. And I went, oh boy, how am I going to have this conversation on text? And the only thing that I could say, and I don't even know if I had it right. So unlike Pat, I act like I'm still really young. I'm not, but you know, I'm kind of in denial. Right, I tried to be like, I know why. And I said, well, in part because the term people of color makes me a little crazy because it denies the difference that exists there, right? I understand, I've even used the term myself, why we sometimes do it to a whole group of diverse people. And that Black and Indigenous, because oftentimes in my experience, actually in the conversation of race in this country, Indigenous people are the last people on the list. I think we often, you know, we don't have that conversation. It's a Black and it's a white conversation, right? And there's a whole lot of people that we don't necessarily bring into it unless they try to get in there themselves. And it's dangerous territory because if you don't identify as either Black or white, good luck trying to get into the race conversation here in the United States. And I think the Black and Indigenous in part were Black Lives Matter, to kind of call out Blackness in all its diversity, you know, thinking about the diaspora, but Indigenous was to acknowledge that, you know, for me, Native people are often the last on the list on the news about anything going on about race, in our curriculum, in our conversations. I mean, I know people are working to change that, but if I'm going to be really honest, you know, they're not always in the room. And I think there's a lot of problem about that. So I'm really careful too about what the acronyms mean and finding ways not to disrespect people's use of it, but actually to challenge us, as Pat is saying, and challenge myself. You know, what am I really trying to say? And yes, it takes more work to figure that out, but that's actually the work. Like if it's about shifting paradigms, making different choices, you know, it means, okay, I got to do a little digging. And I just want to give a little, a shout out to things like Afrofuturism, because there are places where, at least, at the very least, in the Black community broadly, there are people already doing that work who are thinking not just aspirationally, but the future, bringing the past in, having a sense of how all of that's connected. And there's something really creative and beautiful and resilient about that. I'm not saying that everything that comes out of that is correct, but it's not about being correct or not correct, but it's certainly courageous and creative and brave. And there's a lot more space to play than some of the paradigms that we've been given to play in right now.
And I'll just say before we open it up for questions that that is what I do appreciate about that term, is that we're not, now we've moved from people of color and we're saying, and at this moment, and especially since the very tragic murder of George Floyd, to say, yes, the whole conversation switched to black and white, but there is this place of saying, and we must not leave this out. So that's a signal, Indigenous people, we cannot leave them out.
Yeah.
And so that's a signal that some of the work and thought that's gone into it is working.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Okay. Divya and Gabe.
Wow. Thank you both so much for all the insight that you have shared so far. As Pat mentioned, we're going to be opening up the floor for questions from the audience. And so feel free to like keep putting in questions and also liking questions that seem exciting to you, so we can see if there are some that are particularly calling for the audience. But one of our first questions, I think, is we wanted to pose is, what does it mean to belong to a place? And I know Pat talked a little about like the symbiotic relationship, but this is something that I'm very interested in as well, considering I'm like first generation immigrant. And so what does it mean to belong to a place, and like what will it mean to belong in a time of change and movement for, you know, for so many humans and to all other beings?
Usa.
Well, maybe I'll start to answer that one, and a little bit. That's a big question, right? And so when I want to talk a little bit about your opening acknowledgement, and there is this really incredible, amazing movement in most of the circles I travel in, and even on my Zoom calls where people have it as part of their name, they're identifying who are the original peoples of the land they're on, right? So that's kind of incredible, actually. I mean, versus where we have been, and now moving into this new place that makes total sense. So, you know, to do land acknowledgement is for this reason, in my view. It's to say, gosh, and in fact, when we had our moment of silence, this is what I did. I'm addressing the Abenaki people, and I'm saying, thank you for upholding the honor of being human being by going into such a profound and deep relationship with place. And because you were willing to do that, that place thrived. And because you were willing to do that, the Mother Earth could receive you and work with you and develop you into a kind of human being that causes life to thrive. And so that's that, because that relationship took a long time and a lot went into it. That's, to me, what the acknowledgement of the land is. And that's why we say, I am on this land that these human beings had this kind of relationship with. So as a human being in that lineage of human beings, I'm acknowledging that I'm sitting on this relationship, this profound relationship. And so to me, just to say, that's what land acknowledgement is. And see if Carolyn wants to say anything.
Well, just, you know, people who know me, belonging is one of my, you know, the big things that I'm really interested in. What does it mean to belong? And, you know, I was listening to you, you know, with talking about sort of land and a sense of connection to land. And my first response is to belong is about being able to feel like you're part of something larger than yourself. And you're not part of something larger than yourself simply because you say so. Now, I'm not simply part of something and I belong because I say so, but it's because other people say so. And I think one of the challenges, and I don't mean that I give away my freedom to make that choice, but part of belonging is being connected to other human beings who value my presence and my humanity and my experience. And the thing is, when you've lived in a country that has told you in no uncertain terms for such a long time that you don't belong, and even when you say you do belong, still tell you that you don't belong, the idea that you can still be murdered in the street on camera, the idea that you can still be
by the authorities.
Thank you. The idea that you can't even, you may not be murdered, but you can get stopped and challenged just by simple, you're going jogging, you're walking, you're driving, all of those things, for me, is a not so subtle way of saying you don't belong. One of the things back this summer, I was reading a story about a young 15-year-old Black girl whose name happened to be Brianna Nix. Oh gosh, I forgot her last name there for a second, but her first name was Brianna. She's 15. She lived with her African-American grandfather in a very, well-to-do, predominantly white neighborhood called Wellington, Florida. And she was with her two white friends, and she's, standing in front of the house talking to her two friends. And there's a video of this older white man yelling at her, telling her that she doesn't belong there. And I just recoiled because I had that happen to me when I was 9. I said, that's it. Even when you state, you can own your own stuff. Henry Louis Gates, well-known, well-off African-American professor trying to get into his own house, getting arrested. I mean, there are so many stories that we've heard and so many we haven't, over and over again. You do not belong. And so I think of, how does that change? I actually, I don't want to wait for somebody else to change to tell me I belong, but I understand belonging implies relationship. So if belonging implies relationship, whether to people or place, that means there's got to be something mutual going on. There's got to be something mutual going on. I can't do it on my own. I can't belong just because I say so. So the focus for me is always like, so how do we build a different kind of relationship? Because I'm going to do what I'm going to do. I don't need you to tell me what to do, but because I want that relationship and I want to grow, I got to figure out how we can show up, which means there's got to be some recognition of past hurts, present hurts, reconciliation. There's got to be some relinquishing of this universal narrative and this power that defines for everybody else how everybody else gets to show up and belong.
I know we probably want to get to another question too, but I just want to say that in terms of with all this motion in modern world, there's a question I get asked a lot as I try to describe what being Indigenous is and how an Indigenous person cannot be an Indigenous, they can't maintain their indigenosity when they're relocated necessarily. I mean, it presents a whole different thing, let's just say. And so that's the case with many people in modern world and that are not in that category, let's say. And so I am someone who advocates for the concept of our first step is to really understand that we are all Indigenous to Earth. Now that can be problematic for some Indigenous peoples because we don't want to erase that actual distinction about being an Indigenous person of place and having that deep relationship. But at this moment, humanity is trying to act as a large part of humanity is trying to act like it doesn't matter whether they're on Earth or Mars or Mercury. Like they're just like, we could do this anywhere because it's all in our head. People live in these giant urban centers where everything they look at is something that came out of the human mind, which is a great way to forget where you are and what it means to be on Earth. So that's what I mean when I say, for me, one of the first steps is to really acknowledge we have to recognize that we are Indigenous to Earth. So that's a process that can be begun with anybody, anywhere, I'm going to say. So maybe that's a small answer to that question.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing that. So we've had two questions that both were asking in different ways about gender. And so we've talked a lot about, this conversation between, being a Black person and being an Indigenous person. But could you maybe also touch a little bit on what it means to show up tonight and have this conversation as women, and how that, and how gender also plays a role in your work in a number of ways?
Yeah, well, I have a few things I could say. First of all, I want to acknowledge that gender is not a two-way street, as we know, right? It is much more fluid than that. And as an older person in denial about my being older, I have to really, continue to self-educate what that actually means to understand gender more fluidly. I can speak from my own experience as someone who identifies more traditionally as a woman, though I don't like to have parameters, but I understand, biologically, how I've kind of showed up in the world. When I first started doing this work as work, I actually started from the gender place, around gender, environment, and thinking about place. And I shifted, and I want to say expanded to race for a lot of different reasons. I think that, I had an experience today, and actually I told Dave, I've told a few people this already, and I'm not going to go into it, but the ways within which, I received an email from a self-identified white male in academia who calls himself, he's a chair of a department, who has started inviting me to come speak, and we exchanged a couple of emails, but then there was a week went by before I followed up and responded to him. I've been busy, life goes on. And I got one of the nastiest emails I've received in a really long time. And yesterday when I got it, it stayed with me for 24 hours, where he just berated me for not, getting back to him. What did he think that he was tired of having to nag me. He doesn't have time for that. He wasn't going to come here and get on his knees and beg me to speak to his class. It was outrageous. And at the end, he said, frankly, he was humiliated that I didn't have 2 minutes to respond to him, that I wasn't worth his time. I had other things there was nothing there. And I thought to myself later, because he knew who I was, would he have done the same if I had been a white man? Was it because I was a woman, because I was a Black woman who happens to be 2 years older than him, that he felt he could lay into me like that? That the level of rudeness and disrespect was so beyond, it was beyond about not even professionalism, but whatever was going on with him. So I often think about gender as, I know within the Black community, we have had historically, let me just say it lightly, some issues around those traditional gender lines. In terms of power, I saw it in my household growing up. I saw it when my father, who has been through so much trauma in his life and worked really hard to provide for his family, as he had to run every time the bell rang on the side of his house for the white family he was working for, that when he came in that house, he told me and my mother, as the two women in the household, I'm the king of this household. If you both don't like it, you can pack your bags and leave. And he said it all the time. And he still showed up every day for his job. He never left the family, but he reinstated those lines all the time. And that is a conversation that I know within the Black community, we're not always comfortable with having, because it reveals some of, I think, of our own fault lines about the struggle for. The thing I've come to understand is about the pain that my father as a Black man has had to carry for 88 years of his life. And I have worked really hard to try to participate in his healing and anything. But that doesn't mean he gets to abuse me or my mother because of it. So there's something about, there was about the race thing there when I gave that example earlier, the personal familial things that happen. We don't even have to go outside the home because we know how this gender thing flies and gets laid down. And this comes back to, I think, something Pat was saying earlier, but where's the healing start? What is our responsibility and our agency within our communities to address and understand that? Have we so bought into the idea that the genders, there's a hierarchy of genders, and that if we make space for one, we ain't got room for the other? Is that the only way one gender can claim their power is to diminish another? We have bought into it so fully that we damage ourselves in the process. And women just dealing with everything from the imposter syndrome to, having to make sure that you better call me Dr. Finney, even though that's not really how I roll, because I got to make sure that there's respect, because I can't trust you, because I have to always be affirming myself as a woman, and in particular as a Black woman, and still keep my sense of humor, and still keep my heart wide open, and be ready and vulnerable and accepting and empathetic. And you don't have to be. Right. And so, I'm the you as a general you, y'all. I know that all you out there are, because I believe it. But I'm just saying there's something, for me, that's how gender often shows up. And there's an intellectual conversation about feminism and all the ways within which gender and the environment and women are more close to the environment and all those things that I studied too. And I think actually essentialize not only who we are, but who we can be. And what do we do now that we understand gender is much more fluid than that? Actually, gender has always been more fluid than that. So how do we open up those gates? I'm just rolling and we only got a few more minutes. I can't even.
Wow. So that never occurred to me. Here, I mean, not what she just said, but this question of like, why are there two women sitting here having this conversation? And so I'm going to say that, I mean, I think even pop psychology says that women are the relationship tenders. And so maybe that's a part of this, is that, women have to take the big risks for relationship. And for some of the reasons that Carolyn, was just naming, I call this the power over paradigm. And in the power over paradigm, might makes right, which means that men are going to naturally dominate that paradigm. Now, one thing I'll say about gender that was said to me in ceremony was, you think you know what masculine is, but you don't. And you think you know what feminine is, but you don't. All you know is how those energetics, we'll call them, behave in a power over paradigm. Mm. But if you plug them into a different paradigm, they behave in a completely different way. Wow. So that's why I say men are not the patriarchy. It's the paradigm. It's the paradigm that are shaping masculine energy, which has certain tendencies, but those can show up in all different kinds of ways. That strong will, that laser focus thing, that all that can be in service to thriving life, can be in service even to the lead of the life bringer who's got her eye on life. So I have a term for myself, so that's one thing I noticed as I was moving out of modern world paradigm and back in this journey home back to indigenous paradigm, was I was noticing how masculine and feminine are treated. And again, this is, I'm not trying to suggest that there is only binary, and there certainly isn't in my culture. But just noticing masculine and feminine energetic, it was just treated very differently. And so then in this power over paradigm place. So I say my biology gives me a spiritual capacity. It gives me a function that only, I'm going to say, that menstruating women can hold. And there is a truth in that. And cultures all over this planet have an awareness of that. So I'll just point that out, and I'll say that, I call myself Holy Earth Surface Walker, Life Bringer, Life Bearer. And I stand with the full authority of the Mother Earth behind me as the female of our kind. And I have the right to speak on behalf of life in every circumstance and in every place where decisions are being made, as Ruth Bader Ginsburg said. But this has been going on a long time, long before that. I have a right to speak from that place of authority where decisions are being made and where things are being proposed. And anytime we're saying something and I see that we are not putting life at the very center of it, I have the authority to stop the proceedings and say, excuse me, I see we're getting away from life at the center, and life is the center. So let's reorient, let's adjust. Like, that's how I see my authority. So in this relationship of right relations, and I have to wrap this up here, You know, I have to say there is something essential about making this whole and intact and right again. And therefore, I will step forward and participate in this conversation and in any of these conversations as taking the responsibility for that authority for thriving life.
Yeah, wow. Thanks both of you for sharing all that. I know, like, however, I want this conversation to keep going on all night. I know there's at least one question on, intersections of Black and Indigenous spiritualities that I'm really curious about, but and a lot of other wonderful questions in there. But we want to make sure that the audience has time to sort of contemplate what they've seen tonight and be able to make an offering to close our conversation. So in the spirit of the intimacy of right relations, we're encouraging the whole audience to sort of reflect on a hope, a dedication, aspiration for allyship and continued, practice of right relations going forward. And so, as we're thinking about this out in the audience and what that might mean for you, we want to offer just a couple minutes each to both of our conversationalists tonight to leave us with some closing words. So I think Women Stand Shining is going to go first and maybe share a little bit about both this offering and also the last thing she wants to leave us with tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Divya, Gabriel. Thank you, Middlebury College, for having the willingness to hold space for this conversation. I'm gonna ask you and those of you who are part of that specific community to accept as destiny, as destiny, that you were compelled to do this. It's really, really an important and powerful offering to the world at this time. It's very timely. And I don't know how many of these conversations are taking place. They are quite new to me to be engaging in these conversations in such a public way. And I hope that we are inspiring many more conversations, some risk taking to have this conversation, because we can help resolve some of the grief and some of the trauma. And so, as I said earlier, when we resolve that, then we're not only resolving our own trauma, we're not only preventing Indigenous or Dene genocide, ultimately then we're preventing, our humanity's destruction and thereby our Earth's destruction, because we are interbeing. We are mitakwie oyasin, all members of the hoop, members of life sitting on the same hoop. And so I just, I think that's all I wish for, is for us to continue these conversations. And I'm just so grateful. It's a huge honor. I really bow down to the fact that this was brought into being. So thank you.
And I want to say, well, thank you, Women Stand Shining, Pat McCabe. Pat and I, Pat and I were first on the stage together about 1.5 years ago in Louisville, Kentucky, and at something called the Festival of Faiths, which was a really amazing experience. And at that moment, I was sitting next to her on the couch, like, she's amazing. Like, I'm hoping we get a chance to engage again. And so this has been really great, learning from you, showing up with you, and how your words give me permission And I'm not saying that I need someone else to give me permission, but because I also come with a deep respect, a lot of which I don't understand yet, of sort of the indigenous presence here. I don't believe that I'm not going to talk like I actually know what that really means. I'm still, but at least what I can do is respect it, and so that there's space for me to kind of come into the circle with you. I also want to thank Divya and Gabe, two of my students. Yay, I love you both. And Janet Weissman, who always makes everything happen at Middlebury, and Johnny for making it technologically fly, and all the people who have showed up here today. And I want to say, I'm so glad Pat said it like that, that we all made this conversation possible. I don't know about the rest of you, but things like the election exhausted me. Black Lives Matter. I do this work day in, day out about racism. I'm emotionally exhausted. I'm emotionally exhausted. And I'm also incredibly grateful that I get to be alive and awake in a very intentional way at this time. So I want to say two things, and I'll leave it to two very short things as part of my closing. One is that I've been listening to, watching the news like a lot of other people, and Congressman James Clyburn, who's an African-American congressman from the state of South Carolina, has been on TV a lot lately being interviewed. And he said something the other day because somebody asked him, a newscaster, I think, asked him, your opponents were looking at, and this isn't about to say who you voted for or anything, but to understand that what was evident in the voting public was how split we are. A lot of us have always known that's true, but it became very evident, and was saying, how do you, and they phrased it as an opponent, how do you, bridge that? What happens there? And what he said was, and I'm looking at his quote, he said, if the distance between my opponent and me is 5 steps, I don't mind taking 3 of them. And it blew me away, because I thought that the agency, the courage, the intentionality, it's not about so turn the other cheek, in as much as it's a choice that I choose to make, because I recognize that my freedom is wrapped up in yours. And because I really believe in that idea of connection, that we come here. The last thing I want to read is 5 lines long, is my favorite poem. And just that, and this poem always reminds me of just the possibility, particularly that children understand this. And this was written by a young African-American boy in 1981. At the time, he was at PS 153. He was in 5th grade in Harlem. And he said, my heart trembles like a poor leaf. The planets whirl in my dreams. The stars press against my window. I rotate in my sleep. My bed is a warm planet. Thank you.
So we talked about how we might close, or who is going to close. And, I'm going to say, as interbeing, we all have skin in the game here, okay? We all got skin in the game here. We all have skin in the game of what happens here between Black Nation and Red Nation, and our ability to thrive. And so, what I was saying is that in my tradition, sometimes when we're in a purification ceremony in the sweat lodge, we all pray at the same time, or so that's very comfortable for me. I know it's a little weird on Zoom, but I just want us to encourage that it's okay. But that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to open up, hold on, give me 1 second, but open up, unmute ourselves all together, and just name some hope, aspiration, possibility, prayer for the future of this relationship that is being highlighted this evening, but for our world and for us. And so what we're going to do is, in just a minute, we're going to open up you can unmute yourselves, and then we're going to do that all out loud together. And then I don't know if we have the ability to mute everybody, but I'm going to ask you to just watch me. I'm going to make a signal here, and maybe we can at least highlight me on camera, and then we'll close it up that way, because not any one of us can make the whole prayer. Not any one of us can make the composite dream that we are feeling in our hearts that we long for. So it takes all of us to do that. So I guess here we go. Let's unmute, and it's good to say it out loud. That sound has like good vibration. So I'll just say,
Prayer for the
I hope
healing.
that,
May all belong.
might
For
May
understanding the
may
earth
help
and
them to
all
may heal trauma.
all
Humanity underneath,
responsible
May
connect
heal
with each other in shared
may
love and
flowing
reconciliation.
water,
Yeah.
sky,
that
rescue for
we
trees
can
and
in
the
this
plants and the
space, even if
crystals
we
feels
we find
good.
our way to our
Feels my presence
highest life. Spirit, healer,
well
and right
has
relationship.
enough
Thank you.
love,
which is
courage, and strength to create right relations so that we can thrive.
And
Wow, thank you, everybody. So
Yeah.
beautiful. Thank you for
Oh, thank
speaking your
you.
heart.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Oh,
you both.
beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so very, very much.
What a gift.
Thank you, everyone.
Grateful. So grateful.
good night.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Well, take care. Much love.
Thank you. Thank you, Carolyn and Women Stand Shining, for your wisdom and vibrant energy. And thank you, everyone, for being witnesses and participants here tonight. We wish you all strength, safety, and good health over these next few difficult months. And we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Beauty is finished.
Yes.